African Ascent customarily has been treating its huge audience, which is increasingly approaching the 1 million mark, to some of our germinating students at Berklee College of Music, the leading college for the study of contemporary music, and their professors as well. What most people do not know is that Berklee College of Music is not only singularly known for its brilliant musical performance events, it also has one of the leading disciplines in the country, a discipline that we call the liberal arts department, which is really a totality of many other disciplines. And in it are quite a few stars. One of them is Professor Judson Evans, who is a professor of literature and the arts that African Ascent is bringing to you for the first time. Let me read to you a few things that this professor has done. Judson is a poet and visual artist who has written and published a variety of poetic forms and genres. He was director of liberal arts at the Boston Conservatory for 25 years and is now happily a full-time professor of liberal arts at Berklee College of Music, where he teaches courses on Paleolithic cave art and a poetry workshop focused on a range of Japanese poetic forms. He regularly publishes haiku, renku, and haibon in the main journals of those forms. He also writes contemporary lyric poems and dramatic monologues. He has been involved in a wide range of collaborative experiments with composers, choreographers, and has had his poems set to music by composers such as Mohammed Fairouz and Marty Epstein, our very own Marty Epstein at Berklee College of Music. He was chosen as an emerging poet. This must have been quite a few years ago because he has already emerged. By John Yu for the Academy of American Poets in 2007 and won the Philip Booth Poetry Prize, a prestigious one, from Salt Hill Review in 2013. His poems have appeared most recently in Folio, Volt, 1913, a Journal of Forms, and Cutbank, prestigious, well-known media of poetic publishings. What a great pleasure for African Ascent to introduce itself to the works of a great poet, namely Professor Evans. Welcome
Thank you.
to African Ascent.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be with you.
Well, I've been reading some of your works, and I must say, from my heart, how impressed I am. But what I noticed in some of your works, with the exception of a poem that I really loved, called The Dishwasher, is their complexity. You're a very complex poet. One of the most complex poets that I have ever read, on whom I wrote my master's thesis in philosophy, with the French poet Baudelaire. But his was a complexity of a different kind. Yours, I think, the complexity in your works, I think, is complex partly because of the function of these entanglements, as you call them, quite poetically, between the scientific gaze and the poetic curiosity. You're drawing from these two massive sources, which even in our time continue to work across one another. Let's begin with that and talk about what you mean by entanglements. What a name you've given to your work. Entanglements, correct.
Well, it's a phrase that comes from quantum physics, and it has to do with with the idea that there's an unpredictability about where a particle is or how we interpret it, that it's in multiple contexts at once. And not to go into the details behind it, but what I'm interested in is the way a poem can be a kind of palimpsest, a set of layers written on top of each other to represent the ways in which we exist in time and the way our experiences are entangled with each other. And thinking of language as a place where they can be woven around each other. I just saw a show at the MFA of Cecilia Vicuna's work based on the Inca Quipu. And looking at those strands, sometimes a strand has been used and reused multiple times, and each time it's been turned a different way or dyed a different way. And by the time you look at that finished strand, it contains the history of all those experiences. And I would love to feel that the poems can do something like that, that they can contain or they can layer different moments of time, different experiences. And sometimes I am really drawn towards science to find a language for that. Most often the biological sciences, because I'm surrounded. My husband happens to be a pathologist. My brother is a physiologist. My sister is a nurse. I started in pre-med and failed miserably and decided that that was not my calling. But I certainly love the language, and I love the way it lets me have metaphors that can get at things that I can't seem to get at otherwise. So maybe I should start with, I didn't bring a lot of my more scientific poems, but I did bring one, which is a poem that has been on my mind because one of my students at the Boston Conservatory at Berkeley set it to music recently. And so that was really an exciting experience. A wonderful young composer named Blake Pilger set it to music. So I find that poem, and the poem is called Telomere.
Yes, I've read it.
And a telomere is, I guess you could describe it as a kind of hubcap at the end of a chromosome. It's the thing that keeps the chromosome from breaking down, decaying. In a sense, it keeps us alive. It's a kind of a water clock of our own existence. And so it connects with mortality.
Yes.
And it's interesting to me that if we were to Google the word, you'd find thousands of products about extending life. And so to me, I'm interested in that combination of the way the word suggests a kind of scientific Prometheanism, the idea that we can live forever through science. And at the same time, it brings us back to our frailty, the fact that we're based on these very basic biological elements. So take me a minute of shuffling to find the poem.
Take your time.
Okay, so this is telomere, and it has an epigraph from an ancient Greek philosopher, Alcmaeon of Croton. And that epigraph is, "We die because we cannot connect the end and the beginning." We die because our intentions can't touch their toes, because we can't zip our freezer bag from the inside or heel ends of the power strip, because we lose the splice of Scotch tape and invisibility sticks to doors, because wicks won't pollinate and we can't laugh in the past tense, because we were built to careen like hubcaps, not ascend like suits at the dry cleaner, because of predictions in folds, cheat notes and fortune cookies, overbite and undertow, because of the wrong buoyancies and the right delinquencies. Catch one thread, snaggle one tooth of the zipper, loosen the spring end of the toilet paper roller, leave one canceled train ticket or condom in an old wallet, scrawl a writing sample from a finger slammed in a car door, patch tar or wet cement in the crawl space you want to dream back. It's too late. Your barcode is warped. Your password isn't recognized. The free trial is over. Nothing is left open. So it's a little bit of, it's both a little bit dark and a little bit of a joke of about our dreams and our frailties, I think. But it's interesting.
Do you believe in immortality at all?
I think I believe in, again, my metaphor of palimpsest. I believe that that those that we have loved are layered in us, and we become layered in them. I think I believe in a kind of very biological, very generational kind of immortality. I don't really have a faith in a God or in, but I do have a kind of faith in continuities of language and meaning and culture.
Are subatomic articles, which are part of the foundational infrastructures of our existence, subject to death, or are they subject to deathlessness?
I suppose when I think about that, I'm kind of a Lucretian, you know, going back to that, the ancient Roman idea of everything being a kind of endless movement of atoms in a void, and the sense that there can be a kind of swerve into that brings greater organization or lesser organization. And I think that there is a kind of indestructibility of the basic elements, and I think that that's part of the sense that I have of the way nature works and the way human nature works. This sense of elements of chance, elements of organization, elements of swerve and disorganization.
How salient is the theme of death in the poem that you just read to us? The first three stanzas move towards it, but then you move elsewhere.
I think,
struck.
I think it's
the poem began.
Yeah, it's impossible. I think it's impossible not. By the time one is middle-aged, it's impossible not to have that theme come to dominate, and especially with losing so many people in our lives. I think that I write a lot about mortality. It's a crucial theme for me. I lost my mother back in March, who was 86 years old. I was very close with her, and I think that experiencing her death has taken me back to that, all of those questions about what remains when we lose someone. In what way are they still with us? One of the things that's obsessed me is the idea of when you give someone a gift and that person is no longer with you, where does the gift go? I wrote a poem about that, in fact, that just thinking about that idea of the circuit of the gift.
Do you have it with it?
I do.
I'd like you to read
it's
that.
a very new poem, so it may very well go through further revision. But I think maybe what I would say is that I do think of poetry as a way of problem solving, in a sense, trying to figure things out about our emotional lives, and just using language as a tool to try to think these things. So this is a more personal poem, necessarily, because it is about my own relationship with my mother, and thinking about over the years, I make these objects, actually, I make these things called haibun. They're a combination of haiku and visual art, and I gave her probably, there must be 20 or 30 of these objects. And she put them all in the same wicker basket that sat up above a kind of china closet, and everywhere she moved, this basket moved. And then after her death, my sister sent them all back to me. Wow. And the feeling of having them back was it was profoundly moving. It was both sad, and it was also kind of an uncanny feeling. And I wanted to try to think about that idea. So this poem comes out of that.
Incredible.
It's called Broken Circuit.
It's a way of experiencing your mother's presence.
I think so. I mean, I think of poetry as a way of intensifying experience, memory, all of these things.
That's right.
Broken circuit. Of, in, how, she carried and kept them. All the gifts, always on top of the china closet, even as she moved from place to place, contained the objects I made for her, haiga formed of paper and poetry, all the years of moving away. Or as if she'd always held the basket, wicker, bristly, woven, on her head. A caryatid, or the small wooden sculpture of a woman she brought back from Kenya carrying water, or the news photo of the Indian woman, her household effects on her head above the flood. Just as she gave her own paintings to dentist, doctor, hairdresser, just as we reapportion and regift them now, studies of exchange, surplus value, like pollen in a cave where it's sifted in from the glacier-covered witch hazels. I'm searching for the tense to use for this demagnetized migration. Where does it go, the gift? Votive boat laden with fruit and lit candles meant to drown. Her inscription, waterlogged watermark now, only a circumflex of maple keys, lapsed lanes of contrail, the news on the newspaper kite she taught us to tense against the wind. Some of the information becomes noise in the descent. Gravity becomes anti-gravity. Some cardboard boxes and bubble wrap, some burying and burning, some sewn in the pockets of our clothes.
How often do you read this poem?
I've probably only read it once or twice. I wrote it just a few weeks ago, so it's really a new poem for me.
Poem.
Yeah.
And now, before we go further to read more poems, my readers might want to know how you write them. What is the process of writing a poem? What are the moods, the right environments, the time, the temporal, spatial requirement of producing a poem? How does it happen?
Well, I think for me, everything starts with images. Everything starts with a visual, sensual image that registers and then wants to connect with words, wants its place in words. So I would mention haiku because I've been writing haiku for most of my life. I don't consider myself a great haiku poet, but I see haiku as a kind of practice, the way, say, yoga or meditation is a practice. And haiku is an art of the image. It's an art of finding something about a moment, specifically a moment in a particular season, and grasping onto that image and then finding what it needs to have a wholeness and a completeness. And I think that I always carry around a journal with me where I'm waiting for those kinds of moments and recording them. And so I think that's in a way one starting point. And then the other starting point is just language, collecting language, playing with language, letting language almost like a crystal. And those, I remember when I was a kid, there were the experiments you would do where you get a saturated solution and you'd put some seed in that would let it crystallize around it. I think of that as something I do all the time, where I collect language and late at night sit down at my computer and move words around until they start to form some kind of crystallization, and then play with that and edit that until it moves somewhere. And I think those two things combine in my work. I mean, I think that there's both a purely imagistic dimension to it, and then there's a linguistic dimension, and they work back to back. There are times when I write haiku, and there are times when I'm working more with language. And of course, I do a lot of collaboration where working with a visual artist or with, I've worked with dancers at the conservatory. I've been lucky to be able to work with in very improvisational ways, where I'm writing and they're playing, or using film, using different stimuli. But I write pretty much almost every day in one form or the other. Either it's gathering, or it's trying to generate, or it's editing, so that things are going through different processes all the time.
Incredible. Because what I noticed in one of your poems, which I read several times, called The Dishwasher, is a concreteness that your other poems deliberately seem to avoid. It is true there is an image, and even in this poem, it's the image of the dishwasher. But there is something more that I sensed in that poem. Your concern for laborers, for human workers, whom we would otherwise simply ignore as ordinary parts of life. They're washing dishes. That's the extent of our recognition. But in this particular piece, you delve in deeper into what the dishwasher is doing. Do you have that poem with you?
I think that I've never written that poem.
This must have been...
I have written a poem called The Window Washer.
The Window Washer.
Okay.
That is what I'm referring to. The Window Washer. That's right. Not the dishwasher.
The window washer. Okay, because
that is the one.
All right, because I did work as a window washer when I first came to Boston, and that poem is actually in this this collection of haibun. So this is a haibun, and I think that to explain to your audience that since I'm talking about haiku, haibun is when you put together a prose poem or a prose fragment with one or more haiku, and there's a different play of language in those two kinds of poetry. So this is a haibun. It's called The Window Washer. Excuse me.
I enjoyed that tremendously. As I said, it's concrete.
The Window Washer. It's the job I always wanted. Ladder and chamois, buckets and blades, high above the Monday morning traffic. Before I found this niche or airy, I suffered the belatedness of cities, dreams already sublet, area codes exhausted, every inch pre-strung with webs of wires and clotheslines. Secure the swing stage, strap the harness, set the controls on glide. Who says there's no advancement, no future in my work? Even if there's nothing to show but shine, every day's a branching out, another set of stories to scale. The fluid world flows back beneath my blade. Sometimes I see myself on hands and knees, kneeling in the stream you can't step twice in, the wet skin of sky that floats power lines and billboards. Only so many practice runs, steady the squeegee, circle the wrist for the broad, unbroken S-sweep down the glass. Then for years it's all patience, entering the distraction, the blur and clear, made up of those awakenings when the whole ensemble lies before you like a shiny museum case. You open it and touch everything, and nothing can be broken. A whole city soluble in fog, only the antennas.
That's a marvelous piece.
Thank you. That's really
And
a kind of ars poetica, I think.
And it did win an award, I think, in 2004. Am I correct?
Yeah, it did, in fact.
Do you like the poem?
Yeah, I mean, the poem goes back a long ways, and I still enjoy reading. I still enjoy going back to that moment of realizing that this experience could so easily become a way to talk about what poetry was for me.
Precisely. That's what he succeeded in doing. This particular piece made poetry, in my judgment, a guide for humanity.
Oh, thank you.
It makes you think about what you're doing in Heideggerian terms. You're not just doing, you are thinking about what you're doing. You're not just window washing, you're doing much more than that. And a sensitive poet like Baudelaire was in the arcade projects on Sunday afternoons. He used to take these long walks as a flaneur, visiting, looking at what people are doing, and in your language, capturing images and poetically immortalizing them. A I was going to call it the dishwasher again. The window washer did exactly that for me. And then there is the description of what he does. There is a description of the body in movement. So precise, so focused. You gave me an image of what window washing is about.
Yeah, I wasn't a very successful window washer, but I think I'm glad I had that job among those odd jobs that I had when I first came to
But
Boston.
then there is an incredible line there too that gives hope to the hopeless, as Ernest Bloch would say, namely that who says there is no future in this vocation? It's a poetic question with existential implications. It's remarkable.
Well, thank you. Well, you mentioned the complexity in my poetry, but maybe I should turn more to the simplicity in my poetry.
I think you should, and with due respect, it's this particular poem that drew me to you. To be honest with you, the poems in which there is this incredibly complex entanglement, as you call it, between the scientific gaze and the poetic prose. Of course, I'm impressed by the inventiveness of it all. But the accessibility is another matter. And as a philosopher, I had to pose and ask the question, this is for what?
Well, I think that...
What am I being told? Because I'm always respectful of poets, like the later Heidegger, who turned from analytic philosophy to poetry precisely because in a poet such as Hölderlin, Heidegger says, there was a metaphysical message for humanity.
I think that in my own work, I constantly return to haiku as a way to move back to what is most simple.
Yes.
And I feel like it's like a kind of ellipse, that there are things that draw me deeper into language and pushing language in ways that become more complicated, and then I do feel that urge to get back to the image. So maybe I should read some of the haiku.
Please do so.
Because it's fall.
The new poem in Your Mother is the cousin of the piece that you did on the window washer. There is a concreteness to both of them and a relevance.
So I thought I would specifically bring fall haiku because we're in fall and because the last few days have had that really feeling of November. So as probably most people know, haiku are seasonal poems. They have something called a kigo. It's a word or a reference that places you in a really exact way in terms of where you are in the cycle of seasons. And everybody probably knows that haiku generally are thought of as being 5, 7, and 5 syllables. Although in English, over the last 20 years, people who write haiku seriously have thought that that doesn't quite work in English because it's a different kind of language. So instead, we try to find other ways to get some of the formal qualities of haiku, to make sure it stays very brief, to try to keep it concrete. So these will not measure 5, 7, 5, but they have their own structural ways of being close to haiku. Flickering shadows of the autumn day, still in our clothes. Backside of the monarch's wing, the cloud-covered day about to open. Morning beach, the missing eye of the sea bass. This is a poem that's actually, it's called senru. It's in the same format as haiku, but it's more about a human situation.
Beautiful.
And although as an audience can't tell this, I had sinus surgery in late August, and my voice changed in an appreciable way. And this poem is about that. After surgery, calling your name in my new voice. I'll just read one or two more of these.
Yeah, beautiful.
This is last summer I had the opportunity to go to Italy briefly, and I studied Italian at the Dante Alighieri Center, and this is a little poem about the experience of just encountering Italian.
Okay.
Italian 101, irregular verbs for want and desire. Drifting back and forth in the wind of cars, fallen political sign. I'll end with this one. Cutting bruise from a pear, most of November gone.
Can I read one or two? Almost following through the red light, funeral cars, capitals toppled from their bases, the rise and fall of mushrooms. Between our conversation, default to one dimension. Thank you very much for allowing me to read them.
You're welcome. So there's something about these poems that are a way to come back to getting language as close to the object as possible.
Precisely.
And that's part, I see that as part of this kind of ellipse of, I periodically come back where I just want to write haiku. And I would say then haibun is a combination of letting yourself become a little bit more concerned about moving into language itself, but then the haiku lets us come back. Haiku have been referred to as the wordless poem, and I like that idea. A place where words are becoming really minimal.
It's remarkable, yeah. Very economical, and Kant would say the synthesis is powerful.
Thank you.
Kant always spoke about the manifold of manyness, and the idea of synthesis for him captured the unity of the word. So some of these lines do that very successfully. I'm just responding to them philosophically.
Thank you.
All right, and now let's get to the complex ones. We just have to go through them.
Okay, well, talking about
the ones that blend science and
well, you know,
our biology and our existence.
I haven't brought too many of those because
maybe the nude mice.
You know, I didn't bring that poem with me, unfortunately.
For some reason, I thought you were going to bring that. I was looking forward to pierce it.
Well, I could try one that's relatively new that that does something that I talked about earlier. That is to try to layer different experiences on top of each other. That's a little more complicated in the sense that it's doing that kind of layering of different experiences. It's a poem called Permeable.
Okay.
And
Permeable. Okay.
So different things come up that pull in different directions. And, well, I'll read it. You can decide what you think.
Yes, just choose your pieces now, and we'll devote the rest of the interview to your readings. Please.
Permeable. The other day, a bird got into Starbucks, and the manager and 3 employees tried to catch it in a cardboard box. Because it was the solstice, they enacted a ritual concerning the caging of light, the trapping of light force as it threads through space. I thought of the sparrow measuring out a mead hall in the honorable bead, window to window. Gines go to the extent of sweeping before them, wearing white masks to avoid breathing in a gnat. Diogenes searched through the daylight streets with a lantern. This morning we discovered shivers, an old-fashioned word for spider web cracks in the front windows caused by vibrations from the commuter train, or the oversized trash trucks sent to landfills in the poorer suburbs. It's hard for music to get inside the house with windows that interrupt bird flight so drastically. Even with the outer doors and windows left open, concentrations at the membrane aren't isotonic, though by now music fuses with the shadows of birds come in for word crumbs around the kitchen table. each discrete car without cable, with its coefficient of cacophony, song to noise ratio. The glinting pressure comes over you, like norovirus in the commute or tandem tuning forks. I want to hold your hand seems so long ago, such a childlike desire at this social media pornographic distance. With doors and windows left open, it's still hard to hear a cry from a nearby house in the middle of the night, even with every radio and TV set on, or a cardboard box lined with aluminum foil and corkscrew coat hanger antenna, with crystal sets in the attic and a stray ham radio signal coming through the phone and microwave. The blue plastic sleeve of the newspaper doubles the defense against rain, polarizes light, but I can still see through to another massacre everywhere, people trying to get out of where they are, desperately clawing for context, trying to disentangle themselves from headlands and homelands, a broken file of ants where one has been crushed. But the light on faces, the wild chance of lightning or headlights, an animal that can't entirely be domesticated, awakens from its hibernation, slow and docile, but only because it hadn't yet embraced its instinct quickness. So that's the kind of style I've been working in the last 6 months, which tries to pull together various ways of thinking about relationship, that wants to combine moments, very anecdotal kind of moments, and also more images and ideas in the form of images.
That's remarkable. Of course, poetry by definition is splendidly metaphorical, like all languages. So the bird is not merely a physical metaphor of a bird. It is something else. Would you say?
Well, in this case, the bird was a bird in Starbucks, but it started the poem. So
why did you choose the bird?
Well, for one thing, I'm a birder, so I spend a lot of time looking at birds out in nature. So having the bird inside Starbucks was particularly interesting. Also, the disturbance it created, and thinking about that passage in the Honorable Bede, going back to Old English. I remember studying Old English in college, and this beautiful image of a bird flying from one window to the other of this mead hall, being used as a metaphor for the transience of life and the way life passes. And that just kind of caught me. And sitting there in Starbucks having my cappuccino, one thing kind of domino effect led to another. And then the bird, the idea also of because I'm a birder and I love birds, I've often had the experience of having a bird hit the window of the house and either be killed by that blow. And so that's always been a powerful image to me, that sense of enclosure and the being in the inside or the outside, and the way that divides us from the world. So those things kind of come together.
Yes, they did in that piece. I was led to think about entrapment, which is a salient concern of yours. I was also, because I'm a fiction writer, I was also tempted to want you to enter into the inside of the bird and turn the bird's thought inside out and have stanzas addressing that. You see, because our concerns are very different, I suppose, because in fiction we work with characters. We're always looking for characters, and the challenge is to enter them, and inhabit them literally, and then speak for them. So the moment the poem began, at Starbucks, a bird that I know flies and is now in a very hostile environment with non-birds, namely us. You took me In fact, I may end up pleasurizing this image and develop a short story of some kind, because I want it to be the bird, and I want to enter the bird's mind and think as a bird at that particular time and space. So this is what the poem did for me, just by listening to it.
I do have a poem where I do something like that, which is, I read an article in the New York Times about, I don't know, several months ago, and it was about the fact that curators of a Van Gogh painting discovered a grasshopper that was literally embedded in the surface of the painting. And I started to obsess about that. And I wrote a poem that is from the point of view of the grasshopper that's embedded.
I would like to listen to it.
Yeah, I'll find it. I think I have it here. Now, of course, the grasshopper's point of view is going to be rather strange. Okay, here it is. So the poem is called From the Grasshopper Embedded in Van Gogh's Olive Trees. And I just have a quote from the New York Times as a little epigraph. Under magnification, there was an insect in the lower foreground of the landscape of olive trees that was not visible to the naked eye. And this is from New York Times Art and Design, November 8th, 2017. I am cider pressed on the palate, as scattered in space as you are in time, which lends me this wry lens, my oily innards quite blown out, as you will understand, having a body built only for summer, footprints flush with husked grain. I'm a leak or lens in the diaspora of days, chiton and chaff, in backdraft passages of the brush that wicks across the dropped stitch of summer's entropy. I'm the grease stain left of dismemberment where harm is cumulus until I'm of, not in, mouth parts made only to savor, not to feed. There are low-lying rivers in air, limbs that nimbus sun to flex and phospheme. Riven sounds like river here, where umbels of wild artichokes measure the madness of being everywhere at once against the nowhere of meander. Your eye can still finger spiracles of breathing space between the surfaces. Just a screen door, sift and cache before the blast furnace of lasts. Brush fires everywhere in the lavender, but here, under these atmospheres, light pulses on the abacus of poppy stems, where I am optic fiber, made to enumerate, not to store. So that's a kind of imagination in language of the, I mean, you mentioned earlier the idea of death. I think this poem is in a way, death as being the boundary condition of thought. This is an attempt to kind of imagine that in a way. I mean, the emptied out, this emptied out grasshopper for me is just an occasion to kind of try to think my way toward that. That sense of being, as I like to try to imagine death as being a kind of fusion with the world. And I think the poem is playing around with that.
And now, for the rest of our time, I would like you to pick out your favorite poems, poems that mean a lot to you, and share them with us.
Thank you. Well, maybe I'll go back a ways to a poem that I wrote probably about 15 years ago. It's a poem that I wrote for friends of mine two Greek friends, a husband and wife, who had a restaurant in Randolph, Mass, close to where I live. And back at that time, I was studying Greek, and I would go there to try to practice with them. And we developed a really, really wonderful relationship. But Eventually, maybe a year after, I finally got to go to Greece for the first time and had a really powerful experience of being there. And then I had a dream in which my friend's little restaurant was fused with places on the Acropolis. And this dream was kind of a layering of these moments of time. So this is a poem about a dream I had. And I think of this as another Ars Poetica, a poem about poetry. We were always talking about poetry. My friend Costa, who knew Greek poetry, and I was studying Greek poetry. So this is a little bit about this exchange. Greek diner. I should mention too that this mentions taumata, which are these little votive objects that Greek Orthodox adherents sometimes use to make a prayer, and they're stamped tin. They might be in the shape of a hand or a heart or a boat, and they're meant to go with prayers for health or prayers for safe travel, and there are little shops with them. So it starts with an image of that. Greek diner. In the dream, it's a shop for taumata at the edge of the agora. Mulberry trees press through windows, stain the walls. The space is shallower without countertop or tables. I've still not mastered Greek. I say in English, I wondered if you would be here after all these years. And she says, where else would we go? I've made a book against their scorn for my odd hours and summers off, bulky as a metal hinge sampler of carpet or linoleum tile. It becomes a wedge of honeycomb when opened, a great wax tablet glowing with cells. It smells of lemon, pipe tobacco, olives. I ask him for words for my book, more of his stories. First snow in the village, the tinder of grape arbors burning for boiling soup. Words for hill fires in the dry season. But a corona darkens around the workhorse nouns. Tales of occupation through the smell of burning toast. But the poetess, he uses the Greek word, can say anything, can make things, never in this world. And in the stretch of that extra omicron, the world itself becomes world, like words in Greek that almost chant themselves. What do you call them in English, he asks, and I say, it's the same, from your own word, poet. He is shaking his head. It is snowing in the shop. He says, I love snow, but not this snow, snow of my country. I'm no longer sure what country this is, what language we speak, or whether his or mine, the memory of summer so hot I dragged the bed to the courtyard and slept through afternoon until a bird I'd never seen landing on my shoulder awakened me, touching its beak to my mouth. So the birds come back.
Exactly. You love birds.
I do. I think it's something that in my family is something that we do together. We're all birders. Maybe I'll read something that is very new and is kind of a lighter poem that was written in collaboration. Because I mentioned I do a lot of collaborative things, and this was something written for a contemporary chamber group that does a lot of performance in Western Massachusetts. And they're called Row 12. And they were doing a concert on the theme of home. And they were focusing on doors, images of doors. And they had a whole slide projection of images of doors from throughout the world. Very beautiful images. And I was asked to come up with something to read. And I thought that I would focus on doors.
Yes.
And so I wrote this piece based on my own experience of doors.
Are these published pieces, these collections that you have?
Some of these have been published and some of them haven't. This is something that's very new and hasn't. The poem I read, the Grasshopper poem, was just published in an online journal called Interim.
I read it, yes.
Let's see. There's one part of it.
We have 4 minutes left. 5 minutes left.
Okay. All right, so this is called The Door. It's in 3 parts. It's a prose poem, and it begins with a epigraph from the British poet Charles Tomlinson, who wrote, "Too little has been said of the door." 1. Is a door a place? And if so, where is it? Because a door as thing is site-specific. Door to the iconostasis of a Greek Orthodox chapel visited once on the island of Poros. The door of a dollhouse in an attic in Maine. An unhinged door leaning against a sawhorse, a summer house near the ocean, where the blue, oversized door spray-painted on a cement wall in the occupied territories. 2. So the door to the front office, that constantly recurring problem, that bad tooth sought out by the tongue. The whole year of fuss devised to keep it closed since it broke. Well, since I broke it. Well, not just broke it, in a flurry of anger, kicked it so hard that the latch smashed through the jamb, rendering it both too embarrassing and too splintered to repair. It had come to turn without engaging the lock, to turn and jam and turn, and rattle and catch and slip and turn. My solution by midwinter was to deploy a tethered ski glove as a catch between the surfaces, solo glove whose other half had been lost, attached by a thick rubber band to a nail driven directly into the woodwork. I thought briefly about trying to repair the works of the lock, which I finally took apart, looked online to understand the parts, but became distracted into the language of locks. The round chute running in a long continuous guide sounded like a fox hunt. Engaging the staple and striking the backplate sounded like baseball, and sliding shackle or other member sounded like something out of the Marquis de Sade. Then there was the dog inside the latch case, the bow of the key, the existential distinction of outward and inward opening doors, which made me remember the time I locked my downstairs tenant in his apartment. His door had been battered down by an intruder on a weekday when we were all at work, and it became my responsibility to replace and hang a new door with a deadbolt before the next morning. It took me a whole evening, counting 3 trips to Home Depot. He was watching a late-night movie when I poked in and gave him thumbs up, strode triumphantly upstairs. The phone call came 10 minutes later. I'd installed the deadbolt backwards. He was trapped in his own apartment. 3. Twice I've dreamt I wake up in the middle of the night to find every door and window open. I go around collecting doorknobs, door knockers with lions and Medusa heads. I take selfies with mail slots under buzzers. I write down misnumbered addresses in loved cities like Tokyo, where there is no sequential logic to an address. And I remember when I was 4 or 5, the bathroom door, with its hollow sound that swelled in the summer and would catch and vibrate, and was removed and burned when discovered to be full of ants. I'm encouraged carpenters admit to the unappreciated complexity of doors, where the disorientation of 4 compass points converge. I wish philosophers would admit the same.
That's remarkable. I think we have about 2 minutes left, and you had brought something.
Yes, so I brought a piece that was another collaboration.
Mm-hmm. Should we show it?
I think so.
To the public, if we can.
This is a kind of experiment I did with the filmmaker and photographer Ray Klimek. And the concept was, now Ray is a videographer who's focused very much on carbon. Mm-hmm. And he had a show in Pittsburgh called Carbon. Both of us come from the anthracite coal mining region in northeastern Pennsylvania, so both of us have written a lot about that part of the world. And he asked me for the show to develop a poem about carbon that somehow referenced living in that world, and to type each draft one on top of the other in a piece of carbon paper. So it actually took me a while to find an old typewriter, which I rented, and then to find carbon paper, and then type the same poem as I was working through my various drafts, one on top of the other. So there are 4 different drafts of the poem typed on top of each other, and then it was scanned, and he turned it into this print.
Remarkable.
Do I have time to read the poem?
Yes, I
Okay.
think so. Quickly. No pressure. I'll hold it.
Okay, if you can hold it, I'll find the poem. So the poem is called Collier's Mansion. I'm having a hard time finding it. Here it is, okay. Collier's Mansion. So we began our new life in the Anthropocene. Like a map crunched back against its folds, the house was a crush of gluts and thinning wires, a windsock to measure flows and choke points. Our bituminous bodies in their soft serve friction sifted and panned into different grades, already fuel for future stockpiling. The tarred timbers we hid under, used as props for plays and daredevil leaps, contain the times tables that memorized us, formed the trestle where layers of mashed snapshots were buried in calm and composted. The smell of other boys, the smell of broken bags of lime, moldering wood of sheds, wet rope, tar, ragweed, and stagnant water on barrel tops. A bucket a day stayed cold and poisoned the cellar with monoxide. The ashes had to be shoveled out for days. Remember the asphalt smell of spring when adolescence broke into the body like a mine fire? To stay warm in the onset of adulthood, we put thicker albums on the fire, wobbly slabs of sound with tire prints bringing up frequencies of seafloor. Everywhere, great violence slowed on a turntable with a stack of quarters on the stylus. The fracking of our words before they grew faceted. Well, thank you very much for this
My pleasure.
experience.
This has been your host, Theodoros Kiros, for African Ascent.